Good Tuesday evening, everybody, live from the Hill Studios in Washington, D.C. This is the Hill Decision Desk, 26 data nerds. Another Tuesday in 2026, so somebody somewhere is voting, and we have a slew of primaries to get to tonight. I'll be joined by a host of friends over the next 2 hours or so. We're going to get started very early because we have already got our first projection from DDHQ. It is in the state of South Carolina, where Darlene Graham, the sister of late Senator Lindsey Graham, is projected to at least make the runoff in this special GOP primary for her late brother's Senate seat there in South Carolina. Right now, with 33% of the vote to Russell Fry's 23%, Congressman Ralph Norman's 22%. We'll see where these numbers ultimately end up, but DDHQ very confident that Darlene Graham will at least make the runoff. We will see if she can build upon her lead or if either of those two gentlemen can maybe close the gap. But right now, it looks like it is in a race for second place. With that said, I'm Cory Smith. So good to see everybody. Let me go ahead and bring in our first two friends of the night. Kristen Eskow, NewsNation Washington correspondent, here in studio with me. Always good to see you, Kristen. And Grace Panetta, politics reporter at the 19th News, joining us as always. I'll let you two take your pick. Which race, which state, which candidate are you watching on this primary Tuesday night? Grace, we'll start with you.
Yeah, great to be here as always. I have been in Wisconsin. Sorry, a little off center. I was in Wisconsin reporting on Francesca Hong's campaign last week and the week before. So obviously be watching that. That's going to be a huge story. But also a couple primaries in Minnesota, the Senate primary between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig, and then the three-way Democratic primary in the 2nd District for Angie Craig seats are the top ones I have my eye on tonight.
Kristen, what are you watching?
I'm definitely watching that governor's race that Grace mentioned in Wisconsin. Francesca Hong going up against David Crowley, who's seen as the establishment candidate backed by Tony Evers, and ultimately what this all means for the direction of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, look, tonight we are going to see if the left can continue its march through the Midwest in Wisconsin, in Minnesota. We've also got primaries in Vermont and Alabama as well that we are going to bring you, and the great state of Connecticut. Can't forget about that. I want to ask you guys who you think is probably, regardless of their results tonight, and obviously that'll have an impact, which candidate do you think we're going to be talking about the most tomorrow? Grace?
Ooh, it's a tough one. I think Francesca Hong, no matter what happens, she was the first Democratic Socialist to run statewide in a primary like this. We've seen Democratic Socialists do very well in U.S. House primaries. And this is going to be the first statewide test. Another kind of dark horse pick is perhaps Congressman John Larson, who has a primary challenge in Connecticut's 1st congressional district. He could be the next House incumbent ousted.
Kristen, same question.
I do agree with Grace. I think Francesca Hong, regardless of the results tonight, at this point, the polling shows that she is expected to win the nomination, likely handily. But we did see, in Michigan, some of the polls leaning more toward Abdul El-Sayed, and ultimately that wound up being a pretty close race. So time will tell tonight how the results pan out. I'm
surprised neither of you said Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy. How are you not? How are you not going to be talking about Mike Lindell tomorrow? Of course, he is the Trump-endorsed challenger for the GOP governor primary in the state of Minnesota. Let's go to Minnesota because obviously after Abdul El-Sayed's big win last week, big from the standpoint of it was a major win, even if the margin was a little small. But we're talking about moderates versus progressives. So let's go to Minnesota, talk about Peggy Flanagan versus Angie Craig. And I was thinking about this race earlier today, wondering whomever wins sort of also sets the stage for 2028 in terms of who will be the kingmaker or the queenmaker, because you've got this wing of Bernie Sanders, AOC, Elizabeth Warren endorsed candidates. Then you have the Schumer endorsed candidates there in the Senate. What strikes you about this race, Grace? I know you were in Wisconsin recently, but as much as they want to say they're very different states, electorate's somewhat similar between Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Minnesota is a bit bluer than Wisconsin is, but very, very influential state. And yeah, like you put it, this is really another kind of sort of similar to Michigan, but also a little bit different. This kind of contest between these two different wings of the party. And what's really interesting about this race is this is where immigration has been really, really huge. My colleague Mel Barclay did a really great story for us about how Angie Craig, being one of the House Democrats who voted for the Laken Riley Act, which was the first big immigration law Congress passed with a lot of Democratic votes early on in Trump's second term, has kind of come back to haunt her a bit. It's been a major attack line from Flanagan, especially with everything that's happened in Minnesota immigration-wise. So that's going to be really interesting to see if that does, is credited as one of the reasons for the result tonight, no matter what happens.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you realize how much of an eternity there is between big news events and an election. Obviously, the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy made Minnesota the sort of epicenter of the mass deportation effort, clashing with protesters out there. What do you make of these races, Kristen, and especially Minnesota, and all the news that has happened? Do you think it's still on the minds of voters, or does it always come back to what it always comes back to, the economy?
I think it is, especially in Minnesota, because this was local news for much of the state there. And that's something I'm sure that's weighing on voters heavily as they go to cast their ballots. And we'll see, I guess, as we head toward the midterm elections in November, whether that does weigh on minds nationally or not, especially if there are any more incidents connected to ICE or things of that nature.
In that Minnesota race, Grace, do you expect Amy Klobuchar to be the nominee tonight for the Democratic governor primary?
Yeah, it looks like she's pretty decisively cleared the field for that race. And that should be in the general, should be very, very easy lock for her as well. Has quite an electoral track record in Minnesota.
Grace, I want to ask you another thing. Just given so much has happened in the news with the war in Iran over the last week between primaries, what are you hearing out there from voters who are concerned about the war and the economic fallout from it? Is it something that could have some sticking power if we sort of continue down this sort of stalemate path that we're on when voters ultimately go to the ballot box in November?
Yeah, I think it absolutely could, for the reason that this is a vehicle-centric country. The vast majority of people own a car and have to drive, and gas prices are a real sticking point. When I was reporting in Michigan on the Senate primary, I went to a meet and greet that Abdul al-Sayed was speaking at, and there was a man there who, was brought there by a friend who said he wasn't very politically active, hadn't really ever voted, but the increasing gas prices made him want to, get more engaged and tune in. So I think it could be a real issue. The Republican Party, Trump won on affordability 2 years ago, and it's still something that voters are really concerned about.
And Kristen, obviously, Congress out of town on their August month of August recess. But before lawmakers left, what sort of sense did you have about where they thought this war was and the sort of political implications that it could have come November?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Of course, you'll hear more confidence from Republicans about the direction of things and how quickly this will wrap up, how soon we'll see energy prices come down. A lot more concern about that from Democrats, who think that ultimately gas prices won't be back to their pre-war levels for quite some time, possibly into next year. So definitely varying opinions. But of course, as talks continue regarding the Strait of Hormuz, there's a lot of uncertainty for sure.
So we know that South Carolina polls closed at 7. As soon as we came on air, we brought you that projection. Darlene Graham slated to make the runoff at least. We're waiting for Minnesota and Wisconsin polls to close at 9 o'clock tonight, so we will bring you those results. Want to sort of talk about the, I guess for lack of a better term, darling of primary Tuesday night right now. Francesca Hong in Wisconsin. I like to think I pay attention to politics across the country, right? With everything that is going on, it can be hard. Francesca Hong's name, to me, seemingly just came out of nowhere. Kristen, what have you made of sort of the coverage that she has been getting. We're seeing a lot of her old interview clips surface. Even some of her more recent interviews have been interesting, to say the least. What have you made of her sort of rise to prominence and the sort of political consciousness of the country?
Well, it certainly was a big rise, Cory, because she entered the race basically as a long shot candidate, but then started to gain a lot of traction. She's a Democratic socialist backed by the DSA. And as the race progressed, we saw some candidates leaving the race. Former Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, both left the race. And so she emerged more and more as a front runner in this race. And what's interesting about Wisconsin is, you wonder how successful a socialist candidate could be, a Democratic socialist candidate could be in a general election. Keep in mind, Milwaukee actually has had 3 socialist mayors between 1910 and 1960. You may have learned that from Wayne's World, like I did. But what's, that's a state where we also saw socialists in the state house, socialists in Congress. So, it'll be interesting to see how well she can hold up in a statewide election, assuming she secures the Democratic nomination tonight.
Grace, what have you made of sort of the David Axelrods of the world saying, perhaps it's maybe best if Francesca Hong doesn't pull this thing out because she may scare away not just voters in Wisconsin, but Republicans will try to tie her to Abdul El-Sayed and the other Democratic Socialist left candidates out there?
Yeah, well, so David Axelrod's argument was actually that Francesca Hong winning would be bad for El-Sayed, interestingly enough. And yeah, I think there is, somewhat of an element of, we know that, especially in battleground states like Wisconsin, candidates who are a little bit more moderate, more towards the center, like a Tony Evers, tend to do better. But, with that said, especially in an environment like this, it's really hard to say. Kind of all bets are off. It will definitely be a very, very competitive race, to be sure. And it'll also be interesting, to see how much staying power kind of these old comments have when she has run very specifically on a message of, raising the minimum wage, affordable childcare, and especially this data center moratorium is an issue that's gotten a lot of kind of cross-partisan play. So it's true that she does have some vulnerabilities, but in this kind of environment, it's, definitely would not counter out or say that she's, unelectable writ large.
And on that note, I think what's interesting, too, is that we haven't seen this embrace of Hong by Democrats who are nationally recognized compared to what we saw with Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan. We've seen her be supported by Ro Khanna, Ilhan Omar, but not exactly that same level of embrace by Bernie Sanders, AOC, Elizabeth Warren. So it's been interesting to see some of those nationally recognized Democrats not fully backing her as they did El-Sayed.
All right. If I get my producer's permission here, my team chat, I'm going to say goodbye to Grace and Kristen for now. Thank you both for your time and your insight, as always. Let's go live to Madison, Wisconsin. Mills Hayes, NewsNation correspondent, been on the ground in the Badger State, talking to voters out there, talking to the candidates out there. Mills, good to see you. I'll ask you, since you're on the ground there, what is the vibe like when it comes to Francesca Hong? What are the voters you're speaking to saying about her policies, about her sort of rise to prominence recently?
Right. Well, happy to be with you, Cory. I mean, the biggest thing that I hear from voters that are supporting Francesca Hong is that she is not the establishment candidate, and they like that about her. They like that she kind of is out of the norm when it comes to a Democratic candidate. They feel like she'll go in there, she'll shake up the status quo. I mean, before she ran for governor and even before she was a state lawmaker, she was a chef. She owned a local small business restaurant here in Madison, and then she entered into the state legislature. She currently represents the Madison area, and a lot of people like that she has that working class background. They feel like they can relate to her and that she's not someone that's going to go into the governor's office and just speak for corporations or for other big businesses. They feel like she will speak for the working people, and she has talked a lot about immigration and affordability, and those are things that these voters want to hear about. about. They are frustrated with ICE. They are frustrated with the cost of living, and they feel like Francesca Hong's policies are the correct policies that will get them to a future that may be more affordable for them. I mean, she's talked about having a state version of Medicare for all. She's also called to abolish ICE, and she wants a 1-year moratorium on data centers, which has been a hot topic all across the country. And so we are seeing a lot of people get really excited about her, mostly because they feel she's not a politician. And in this race, though, we do have another candidate. The second person that's leading in the polls is the moderate candidate, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, and he has been endorsed by Governor Tony Evers. And Cory, I spoke to a lot of people who actually voted for Governor Evers and are now switching and voting for Hong, someone he didn't endorse. Cory?
Very, very, very interesting. Mills Hayes live in Madison. Mills, thank you very much. I know you're going to be busy tonight. Hopefully somewhere there's some pizza waiting for you in a news vehicle. But we will see you later tonight at 9 o'clock when those polls close in Wisconsin. Thank you very much. All right, let's bring it back home here to D.C. Joining me, Caroline Vakil, Julia Mueller, campaign reporters for The Hill. Hello, friends. Good evening. So good to see you as always. We'll start like we have every Tuesday. What are you watching? Caroline, we'll start for you.
I think, we're going to be watching, this Wisconsin gubernatorial race will be quite interesting. And of course, Minnesota. I think Minnesota, the Senate race is going to be interesting because I've been hearing that it might be a little bit closer than folks might expect it to be. There's a sense that maybe Flanagan may have had the lead in the poll, but we've seen polling where we've gotten burned before last cycle, or last week, I should say, last cycle. The same thing, essentially.
It feels like it.
Essentially. And so with the Michigan Senate race being directionally correct, but so far off, it makes you sort of wonder how some of these races shake out tonight.
Julia?
Yeah, I've got my eye on Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. These races, for Senate and for governor are, more tests of what we've been talking about all of the midterm cycle so far, which is the direction of the Democratic Party as it sort of grapples still with 2024 losses, looks forward, tries to find new standard bearers. And it's part of this conversation about progressives and anti-establishment candidates and the Democratic Socialist conversation as well.
We're going to speak to a Democratic strategist a little bit later on tonight. Really interesting to see how they sort of approach this new, culture war front that's opening up, not just within the party, but obviously Republicans, levying those attacks as well. Want to talk about South Carolina. That was the first projection we got earlier tonight. Darlene Graham slated to certainly make the runoff in this race. We were talking to Mick Mulvaney last week, and he said it was not any sort of foregone conclusion that she was going to win the nomination outright. So, Caroline, does it surprise you that she's going to make the runoff, but not perhaps going to win this thing outright?
I think that, he being a South Carolinian expert, I agree with him that, you can't necessarily take this for granted. And again, the gubernatorial race was one example of where President Trump's endorsement was obviously very helpful, but, didn't end up carrying the day for Pamela Yvette in the gubernatorial race there. And so I do think it is notable that she has placed into the runoff. The question is between Norman and Fry, who seem to be kind of vying for that second place seat right now. How did the coalition sort of stack up after, after Tuesday, heading into the 25th, which is going to be the expected runoff? That is going to be interesting. Do they decide to get behind Trump's endorsement, or do they decide to back each other?
What are you all hearing from voters that you're out there talking to, from the strategists who want their candidates to win? So much, I feel like since Michigan, the oxygen in the room has just been about Democratic Socialists and the GOP labeling them communists, and all the new attacks coming towards Abdul El Sayed. But when it comes to the economy, immigration, which of course is going to be center stage in a state like Minnesota, the war in Iran, Julia, what are you hearing from voters that matters to them at this point in the election year?
Yeah, I think the economy and the war in Iran both continue to be, the big topics for this cycle, and they weigh heavy on President Trump's approval rating and sort of trickle down into all of these races. To your point about, these progressives and DSA candidates and their momentum that they're seeing in this cycle, for tonight's race, I think one thing that's interesting that I've been hearing is, the concern from some Democrats that these progressive far left candidates could become a liability in the general election, as we're seeing President Trump and Republicans try to tie the Democratic Party at large, or to paint it as too extreme, and to tie the whole party to some of these far left positions that DSA candidates may be bringing to the table. And what I heard from Wisconsin Democratic strategist last week was this idea that they said we could have run a really, really moderate candidate instead of Hong, for example, in Wisconsin, and Republicans still would have made that argument. That seems to be something that they're really hitting in terms of messaging. So that's a big piece of the debate within the Democratic Party. But at the same time, some Democrats think that Republicans would have made these kinds of arguments and made it a liability either way.
So, Caroline, does it seem like the Democrats are prepared to handle these sort of attacks when Abdul El-Sayed is getting compared to Francesca Hong, even though they don't necessarily agree politically on everything? Are you hearing a good response? Not good, but are you hearing a useful response from Democrats when these attacks are levied against them?
Well, so you're seeing some signs of the party trying to unify quickly because they see this as an ugly family feud. We've been following it for a long time. They want to get past it. So Michigan Democrats, for example, they had a unity, I believe it was a breakfast or some kind of event after the primaries where they came together after El-Sayed's win. And Wisconsin Democrats are expected to do the same thing after tonight. And so that's just kind of one area where Democrats are already clearly positioning themselves to say, listen, this was kind of an ugly primary, but we're going to come back together after this. And also, going back to something that Julia sort of noted, one thing that's also kind of struck me is that you have Republican candidates who are also not shying away from tying themselves to Trump. I mean, in sort of a way, Democrats and Republicans sort of know that they're not running away from maybe some of the more progressive or more far left, more far right, factions of their party. So it kind of seems like in some ways they're sort of like, this is what we've got and we're going to sort of embrace it.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, I do not envy any candidate out there, just given everything that's going on. What are voters saying about President Trump? Because to your point, you hear some pundits say, these candidates run away from him at their own peril. But when you look at the poll numbers, Julia, he is not a popular president. His handling of the economy is very low ratings-wise. His handling of the Iran war ratings very, very low. Are voters tying the candidates they're voting for to Donald Trump, or do they see them, even with their support of the president, as separate entities?
Well, it's an interesting line that candidates are having to walk this cycle, as the Republicans look toward a future without Trump in the White House, potentially, as he's termed out, right? We're seeing it in the South Carolina Senate race that we're watching tonight. I mean, that race has become essentially a Trump off with Darlene Graham touting his endorsement, but then the other candidates in the race trying to tout their own alignment with the president. As we're seeing, Trump has lackluster approval numbers, and there are concerns within the Republican Party about, just how much candidates should tie themselves to the president. But at this point, he still looms large over the party, and, I think that it remains to be seen whether his support could become harmful as we get into the general, as Republicans are reaching towards the middle or across the aisle for voters. But for a lot of Republicans and for longtime Trump supporters, his say still, is golden in the party.
Don't want to forget about the other states that are having primaries tonight. Of course, Alabama, Vermont having primaries, as well as Connecticut. Alabama's an interesting one because they're sort of revoting here. They redistricted and had new maps come in. Is it just me, or have the redistricting chat sort of dropped off recently? Or are there fears out there, especially from Democrats, that the numbers may end up being in the Republicans' favor so much that it eats into the seats that they need, ultimately, Democrats, to flip the House, Julia?
Yeah, I think, we saw the redistricting conversation stretch out a lot longer than I think people thought it would this cycle. But things have started to quiet down just because we're close enough to the midterms that any states that were considering redistricting as part of this national tit for tat, the deadlines have passed in a lot of these places, even with some of these workarounds we're seeing to make changes before voters head to the polls in November. But I don't think that, experts seem to think that this conversation will will pick back up as we look past the midterms. Of course, it all depends on how things play out for Democrats in particular in their fight to take back power on Capitol Hill. But this conversation about mid-decade redistricting, the legal unfoldings that we've seen this cycle, keeps the door open to more of these redistricting plans and ideas circulating on both sides of the aisle. So I don't think we've seen the last of it, and I think that as we take stock of what happens in the midterms and how control breaks down, we'll see some more talk about what either party can do.
Last thing I'll ask you before we have to take our first break. Will it mean more in Wisconsin, just like it meant a little bit more in Michigan, if you have a far left candidate like Francesca Hong win the primary, Caroline?
Mean more in terms
of get national attention, really sort of, lead to more headlines of the Democrats' left flank is barnstorming their way into power?
Sure, and I think Democrats are going to be taking pains to remind some folks like us that Democratic Socialists and progressives are not the same, which is fair. I mean, you have seen her get, she might receive more attention for the fact that she hasn't received endorsements from Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez. That was something notable that we saw sort of over the weekend, some of these Sunday show circuits, that they didn't necessarily, embrace her the way that we thought. The other thing that I think is sort of getting lost in all of this, if you're a data nerd, is that if you are looking at Wisconsin, it's not just about the gubernatorial race. It's also about down ballot races. And it's not just about Rebecca Cook and Derek Van Orden and CD3. You're looking at state legislative races because Democrats are feeling very bullish about flipping the state Senate. They're hoping potentially the Assembly as well. And so with more competitive maps in Democrats' favor, the question is, if Hong is at the top of the ticket, does that make it harder for those Democrats to flip and create a trifecta into November?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think you're exactly right. We get caught up with the candidates that have the brightest flashing lights around them, not knowing that it's also the down ballot stuff. And Wisconsin, home of the vital Supreme Court election from time to time, that makes national attention. What else, guys? What else are you watching tonight? What are you looking for tomorrow? Or let me ask you this: what is something that maybe the national media, us here, what are we missing right now as we barrel toward Election Day? Oh, either. You guys fight it out.
Well, I think I'll start. I think one thing that I'm looking at, not necessarily tonight, but to Caroline's point about the momentum we're seeing for progressives and DSA candidates. I was chatting with a DSA co-chair the other day about this race. They're looking at this as a potential test of the movement's momentum outside of these blue urban enclaves that we've seen in New York City and Washington, D.C. But we also have next week races in Florida, including one House district where there's a DSA candidate looking to unseat Jared Moskowitz in the 23rd there. And that could be, another test, maybe potentially the last test in terms of the federal races and statewide races of the DSA's power and potency. And after that, I think they'll take stock and maybe look at what happens in the general and beyond.
You said you spoke to a DSA co-chair?
That's right.
How did they say, if you ask them, how do they think their representatives for the organization are doing on TV? Because we're seeing a lot more of them being interviewed now as we try to learn, to Caroline's point, what the difference is between a Democratic Socialist and a progressive. We've seen some very interesting interviews over the last couple of weeks. Do you get a sense from the organization how they feel they're being portrayed in the media and the questions that they get asked are worthwhile and worth the time?
Well, I think they are, trying to, at this point, I think even people within the DSA and DSA candidates acknowledge that their platform, while it's gaining this momentum, is still sort of maybe not understood, or regular voters aren't aware of exactly what the contours of that are. There's some misconceptions maybe. And I think that at this point they acknowledge that and are looking for ways to use the momentum that they've seen this cycle to try and get the word out and educate voters and make clear what their plans and policies are. And I think there's also a lot of, variance among the candidates as well. Each candidate has a different level of engaging with the DSA and its policies as well. So that's something to take into consideration.
And Carolina, just to follow up with you, you said with some emphasis the DSA and the progressives are not the same thing. Is that something that you've been hearing from candidates and strategists out there to draw a distinct line?
You definitely hear some Democrats who, and I mean, experts, folks, the Twitter universe, experts, are trying to make it clear that they're not necessarily the same, which is fair. I think we are sort of lumping the progressive far left faction together. They have overlapping policies. I mean, there are some progressives that are for Medicare for all or abolishing ICE, those sort of platforms. So, I mean, it's, the politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. I wouldn't be surprised to hear more Democrats try to make that distinction. But if they're going to be a part of the Democratic fold, they're going to be a bigger family, and they're going to have to figure out how to make, be at ease with that.
What have you made of the response from establishment Democrats talking about the rise of the Democratic Socialists? I was watching an interview with, I believe it was Jamie Raskin, who said, when people hear the word socialist, they maybe think of Venezuela or Cuba, but there are plenty of other democratic, socially run countries that are doing quite well. Some of them are our allies, especially when you look at Europe. Does the establishment wing of the party maybe sense, okay, these folks are here, we've got to open the tent, but we've also got to learn sort of how to not just talk with them, but talk about them to voters who may be a little bit skeptical about it?
I'm nervous, Cory, because I feel like you're previewing our coverage for later this week, so you might want to stop asking so many good questions.
Okay.
But
my apologies.
But that's a point. I mean, well, for one thing, you can say that the unity events that some of these Democrats are doing in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, that is obviously a clear signal that they are trying to be at ease with the fact that they may not have their preferred candidates winning some of these contentious elections, but do they want to see Republicans win those races? They don't. So they have a shared goal there. The bigger question that I'm always going to be looking for, and I'm starting to see this with some campaigns and party committees, are you going to run a pro, ad campaign for that contender, that progressive or that Democratic Socialist, or are you going to be creating ads against the Republican? How closely are they going to be hugging those candidates? That's the big question I'm looking at.
Julia, 30 seconds, last thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also interesting in the context of, like we said, Republicans working to paint the Democratic Socialist movement, from Mamdani to the candidates we're seeing tonight, paint them as communists, paint the party as too extreme. So I think that adds another layer of difficulty for Democrats in the establishment in terms of grappling with, how to combat that messaging as well.
All right, Julia Mueller, Caroline Vakil, campaign reporters for The Hill. Thank you both, as always. We certainly do appreciate it. We're going to head to break, and when we come back, we'll bring you some more results, as we are about half an hour away from polls closing in Wisconsin. You're watching The Hill, Decision Desk 26 Data Nerds. We're back after this. All right, welcome back to the Hill Decision Desk 26 Data Nerds. Primary Tuesday night in America, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Alabama, South Carolina, Connecticut, and Vermont. We are monitoring all the results for you. Still waiting for some polls to close, but let's go ahead and dig into the numbers that we do have. Joining us now, Jeffrey Skelly, Chief Elections Analyst from DDHQ, and Jerome Zhao, prediction market expert. Good evening to both of you. Appreciate it as always. Jeffrey, I guess we're in a position for you to share your screen. Is that correct, Tom? We'll let Jeffrey do his thing. Walk us through South Carolina. That's the early projection we got. Darlene Graham at least going to make the runoff. Any chance she maybe wins this thing outright?
No, there's no chance she's going to win this thing outright. And we just, in fact, good timing. We just got the projection, actually, that Ralph Norman will be joining her in the primary runoff. Excellent timing. That literally just popped. So, yes. So Darlene Graham and Ralph Norman will be meeting in a runoff on August 25th. And that will be a fascinating contest. And this whole thing's been a sprint. So they're just going to add a few more yards or meters to the sprint. At this point, it looks like a lot of it comes down to the fact that Darlene Graham did have President Trump's endorsement. You do see more of sort of the purple on the map, which is her color she was assigned in our color scheme here. But Ralph Norman doing well, more in his neck of the woods. His part of his congressional district is up in that vicinity where the darkest yellow is generally. But also in some areas where Lindsey Graham in the June 9th primary did not do particularly well. Like Greenville County right now, Norman is leading Darlene Graham by quite a lot there. That was actually Mark Lynch, who is running in this race, but is well down here. He won a couple counties up here in the Northwest, in the upstate. But Lindsey Graham won basically everywhere else. And of course, that's why we're even having this primary, is that Lindsey Graham passed away unexpectedly. And under South Carolina law, election law, they were in a position, timing-wise, to be able to hold this special primary to replace him on the ballot. And Darlene Graham was appointed to fill the seat, his sister, and then kind of unexpectedly decided to run after President Trump encouraged her to run for the full term. And here she is. She might be in a position to win the nomination in 2 weeks.
Jerome, is this result sort of fitting with what the prediction markets were saying about this race that was very quickly cobbled together following the sudden passing of Lindsey Graham?
Yeah, the markets always favored Darlene Graham. There was different points where, there's speculation over whether she would run or not. Then Trump endorsed her and she shot up in the market. I think the market's really watching how closely, she would lead the field tonight. I think they expected that she would probably finish ahead of all the other contenders. But the question was, how strong would that finish be? And around like a 10-point lead going into the runoff is decent enough for the markets to have shot our odds up from around 50% to close to 75% now. So clearly, traders think she's in the driver's seat going into the runoff, and I think it makes sense when you look at sort of the statewide appeal that she seems to have. So even where she's not winning the county, I believe she's finished, in second place, at least, in every single county in the state. And, in South Carolina, these primaries can be quite regional. The two congressmen are leading in the areas where their districts are. But given that Graham is in second place everywhere, I think there's an expectation that, she's in a good position to consolidate the votes of the candidates who did not advance to this runoff.
And we also have a projection out of Connecticut, where Ned Lamont, the incumbent governor, is going to once again be the nominee. He bested State Rep Josh Elliott. This was another sort of establishment incumbent versus the progressive left, and Ned Lamont has come out on top with just about 4% of the vote in, but he had a large lead going into this race. I think Jeffrey was something like 20 points or double digits over Josh Elliott.
Yes, there had been a couple polls, but there hadn't really been that much public polling of this race. But the little bit that we did see did have Lamont ahead, either right around 50% or a bit north of it. And so, it was sort of a situation where Elliott, frankly, because of the public financing system in Connecticut, was able to get a decent amount of money to actually run ads and mount a campaign here. He ended up, I think, with a little over $4 million. And a lot of that, like 3/4 of that, more than 3/4 of that was from the public financing. But Ned Lamont is a very wealthy man, which was part of the Elliott case that Lamont's out of touch, basically. But Lamont, who has a progressive background, or at least once was viewed that way, people may recall he ran for Senate in 2006 and beat Joe Lieberman in the Democratic primary as an anti-war candidate. And then Lieberman beat him in the general election, running essentially as an independent, and Lamont was the Democratic nominee. So it's just interesting to see Lamont here 20 years later cast more as the establishment candidate. Granted, he's trying for his third term as governor, so I think you're going to be doomed to be viewed as establishment at that point.
Let's talk about the big race up in Wisconsin, the Democratic governor primary, where Francesca Hong has sort of risen to prominence recently and is on everybody's news feed. Jerome, what have the prediction markets said about this race? And was there any sort of major swings here, or was it always Francesca Hong, David Crowley that were going to be those top two going at it?
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely not always, because Crowley did drop out at one point before, re-entering the race.
Crazy race.
Exactly.
Crazy race.
Yeah. So for most of this year, actually, the markets were kind of vacillating between Hong, Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, and the former Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. There's times at which each were leading in the markets, but it was all very close. They're around like 30% each. It was only really in recent weeks after Sarah Rodriguez dropped out, after the progressives started really doing well in New York and Connecticut, and there was pressure on Mandela Barnes to drop out, and there was a lot of turmoil on the establishment side, that Hong really started surging in the markets. And going into tonight, there was a little bit of a drop for her right after the Michigan primary because of how well Haley Stevens did, showing that maybe there is some potential for consolidation around the progressives, like Democrats seen as too progressive, and arguably Hong is even more progressive than Abdul al-Sayed. But the late polling didn't really show a super competitive race, and so she's currently at around like 95% chance to win, just based on, I think, some of the information coming into tonight. I expect if, as we saw in Michigan, if the results for Crowley are better than expected, that could tighten. But currently, she's heavily favored.
Jeffrey, there are a few really crucial seats for Democrats to pick up if they want to flip the House, one of them being Wisconsin's 3rd district. That primary, Republican Rep. Derek Van Orden is the incumbent. What do we make of that primary between, right now, Rebecca Cook and Emily Berg appear to be the two candidates everyone is looking at?
Yeah, so it's a two candidate race. Look, Rebecca Cook is basically taking her 3rd shot at this seat. She lost in the Democratic primary in 2022 for this seat when it was an open seat race. And then in 2024, she won the Democratic nomination, lost narrowly to Van Orden, did better than Kamala Harris did in this district. Just to share this for folks, the Driftless area, as it's known, in western Wisconsin, and it's a seat that President Trump carried by, I think, about 8 percentage points, but it is a bit more Democratic down ballot, and so Democrats are hoping in this environment that they can flip it. And Cook has raised a mountain of money. She has long been the National Democrats' preferred candidate. Obviously, she came close to beating Van Orden in 2024, so they'd like her to take another shot. She's actually outraised him overall, though he does have more cash on hand. But Emily Berge, who is a city council woman from Eau Claire, she former city councilwoman. She has mounted sort of a progressive campaign. She backs Medicare for all, and while she hasn't raised nearly the money Cook has, she has raised some money. So she is mounting maybe a more grassroots campaign, and I think there is some thought that she might get close here, or even I don't think she's probably going to win, but she could make this more interesting than I think most people expected.
Jerome, let's move to Minnesota, where the big race there that a lot of folks are watching again is the Democratic primaries continue to pit sort of moderates establishment, if you will, versus the progressive left candidate. You've got Rep. Angie Craig and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan in a very tight race. What are prediction markets telling you about that one? And what do you make of just sort of how close this thing might be?
Yeah, this one is. There's been, I think, more uncertainty in the markets in this race in recent weeks. Also, I think after the Michigan result, there was some sense of like, oh, maybe, polls could be overestimating progressive candidates in the Midwest, in Democratic primaries. Currently, Flanagan is still favored. I think, she has the support of a lot of national progressives and a lot of statewide Democrats in Minnesota. She's at around 70% chance to win, but that is significantly down from, around 85% before Michigan voted. So I think it's definitely not a given that she, wins tonight. And I think, both Flanagan and Craig have run decent campaigns and made their case. And there's actually a chance that, both of them end up in the Senate anyway, regardless of who wins tonight, because the current Senator Amy Klobuchar is running for governor. And so that will likely be a vacant seat if she, wins the general election, which she most likely will. Especially
she would get to appoint her replacement as governor, having taken office and resigned the Senate seat. She would then appoint, and so yeah,
the machinations.
This could be a race for
of
second place. Might be as good as first, just a little delayed.
Yeah. The race in Minnesota that I'm actually curious about is the Republican governor primary.
Yes.
With Mike Lindell, who has.
Thank you. Somebody finally mentioned the My Pillow guy. Thank you,
exactly. And obviously, a candidate who's dived into conspiracy theories and is a little bit off the rails. He's running against the Republican, House leader as his primary challenger. I think that's a race where, all the polling shows that if he is the nominee, he is likely to do significantly worse than any of the other Republican candidates. And that could have huge implications for obviously other statewide races, the state House, the state Senate, potentially even a couple congressional districts that are on the borderline of being competitive.
All right, guys.
Yeah, it's worth noting.
Go ahead,
I was just going to say to that point real quickly. Minnesota's legislature is on a knife's edge. Democrats have an extremely narrow majority in the Senate, and the House is basically tied. So it is extremely tight there. So that could matter quite a lot to Jaron's point.
All right, Jaron, thank you so much for joining us. Jeff, thank you. We will see you a little bit later on tonight. We are watching results come in from Connecticut, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Vermont, South Carolina tonight. Joining us now, I want to say making their maiden appearance on the Hill Decision Desk 26. We've got two strategists, Jeff Burton, a GOP strategist, Jay Satterfield, a Democratic strategist. Guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Always appreciate talking to you and getting your insight. Before we get started, just technologically speaking, make sure you are unmuted. We see your beautiful faces, but just want to get that out of the way first. Jeff, we'll start with you. What are you watching tonight? Are there any candidates on the Democrat or Republican side who you are watching tonight to see how well they do, or maybe if they don't perform as well as some folks think they should?
I think the marquee race right now is the Wisconsin governor's race, where you have another battle among the Democratic Socialists and can't really say more moderate, but the more mainstream candidate. And you really see this continued fight for, what the Democratic Party is going to be, not just in November, but beyond. And that's the main one I'm watching. And then there's a lot of fun in Minnesota in the Senate primary as well.
Jay, what about you? What are you watching for tonight?
Well, I think Jeff took the answers from me, but I mean, these are the most two popular races across the country, if we're being frank. The Minnesota race really is catching my eye the most. Look, I mean, I think both of these senators have a chance, both of these folks have a chance to become a senator. I mean, Amy Klobuchar is picked to win that gubernatorial race, and she actually has the power, right, to name her own replacement. So I could see both of these folks in the Senate within the next calendar year. With that said, it's been a pretty tough primary. It's that moderate versus progressive lane, and it has been a battle to say the least. But as Jeff also mentioned, the Wisconsin governor's race, this is the breakdown statewide, I think, that would be the most consequential going into not only 26, but leading up through 28 too, on who takes control here. And if Francesca Hong pulls this off, as polls have indicated that she will, I think the moderate lane in Wisconsin, and look, a lot of these swing states are going to start to worry a little bit. With that said, I mean, statewide and federal DSA and progressive candidates nationwide, I think this year are 7 and 11. So, I wouldn't call it a full win.
Well, to that point, Jay, what have you made of the coverage, the debate when it comes to the divide, if you want to call it that, within the Democratic Party? Look at a state like Michigan, where we had this bitter primary, but now it's all kumbaya. The Democrats just want to win. How do you see this sort of battle for what the party should be moving forward, and what is maybe missing in the coverage that you're seeing on the ground, and when you're talking to your friends, to your colleagues where you are?
Well, listen, don't let the suit fool you. I'm a dirt road Democrat from the North Georgia mountains, and I'm proud of it. I'll tell you, folks where I'm from are hungry. They're tired. They're worn out. The simplicity of what they want is just that. It's simple. These are simple asks. And the right messenger is what is needed in this country right now, especially within the Democratic Party. And look, I will give it to the DSA and the wins they've had in New York and in Denver and other parts of the country, because it seems their voices were the ones that were needed for that particular area. But the Democratic Party, and I keep hearing folks say the DSA is not a wing of the party. I agree it's not, but they are representing the party this time on the Democratic ticket, and we are a big party, and it's going to take every person to win in every district, no matter where you are. And look, Northwest Georgia is very different than downtown Denver. I think this is very clear. But the Democratic Party's always been known as that party that swings pretty wide, and I think getting caught up in labels, especially at this point with under 100 days left, it's a mistake, and that's just as simply as I can say it.
Jeff, from a strategy standpoint, is the goal with the messaging to make sure voters don't necessarily see that nuance and just say these are either extreme left candidates? Doesn't matter whether they're in Michigan, Wisconsin, Denver, New York. They are all too extreme for you, and you should not vote for them. Or is the message different from state to state, given New York isn't a swing state like a Wisconsin or a Pennsylvania, a Michigan?
And I see why Jay wants to stay away from labels here, because this Democratic Socialist label and the fact that the Democratic Party has become the party of Bernie Sanders and his ideology, and AOC is actually determined, thought it to be more too mainstream, not progressive enough nowadays. So it's been an interesting change in the Democratic Party, but things do change. It's race by race in the midterms, and candidates really do matter. But you can't just throw off and say, okay, the Democratic Socialists are just New York or just one place, because you look at all the incumbents, 5 Democratic Congress members, incumbents being beat now. You look at Michigan, you look at what's happening in Wisconsin and in these other places around the country, and it's not hard to label them as out of touch with the American people.
In terms of the Republican side of things, Jeff, obviously the war in Iran still going on. We're 17 days, I guess, from it being 6 months old. The economy, 23,000 jobs lost last month, folks dropping out of the workforce. What are some of the headwinds that Republicans are going to have to deal with? And do you think, for better or worse, they're just going to have to tie themselves to the president? Or is it, horses for courses, and if it's good to run close to the president, you do it? If it's not, then you sort of don't say anything bad about him, but maybe not mention him as much?
Yeah, it's a balance for most of these candidates in tough races, for sure. And, Donald Trump is by far the most powerful Republican there is. His endorsement of the primaries matter. He's only lost one, and that wasn't really anything that he did, because candidates do matter. But you look at November, and you look at the balance, and you look at people like Susan Collins, who have been able to go against the president. You look at these independents who win over and over again and can find that balance, and that's what they're going to have to do in November, and be able to tout accomplishments Republican accomplishments in Congress, while also making sure that they're in touch with that Americans are struggling now.
Jay, how is the party doing, Democrats that is, when it comes to, we kept hearing the drumbeat of, it can't just be Trump bad, Trump bad, Trump bad. You have to actually let voters know what you stand for and what you're going to do. Has that message sunk in over the last couple of months? Are you seeing a good strategy, a good messaging approach to make sure voters know what these candidates actually stand for and want to do if they ultimately take power?
Yeah, I think so. And look, I'll give a great example of that. There was a special election, actually my home district of Georgia 14, to take over from Marjorie Taylor Greene back this spring. And a candidate that I work with, Sean Harris, brought a plus 37 district down to a plus 12 by talking about the economy, data centers, PFAS that have caused an incredible amount of damage to folks in my hometown and people surrounding it. He brought attention to that matter. He brought a plus 37 down to a plus 12, the third most conservative district in America. So I think Democrats, just based on, and I understand that specials are specials, don't get me wrong, and things come about because of those. But, folks they're angry. I could use other words to describe it. And I think Democrats are really honing in on that message. And look, Jeff mentioned earlier something about labels. And I'd just like to mention that, the Democratic Party, no matter the way you look at it and who's running on that platform, we are not the party of protecting pedophilia. We're not the party of protecting and starting wars into the future that we were promised weren't going to happen. So, the labels in our party, I think, are a little less extreme, no matter how extreme they may seem and come off to certain degrees, even that I may disagree with. But I did want to make that point that you're right. Labels do matter, Jeff. And I think both parties certainly have their labels.
Jeff, what is the strategy for Republicans to run a proactive race? You hear Mike Johnson talk. He's still very confident that Republicans can win, especially given that there is still an eternity before we get to November, and anything can happen with the war and the impacts of it ultimately coming to an end. But what is the strategy beyond, hey, look, these folks are extreme? What is the positive message that Republicans can point to in terms of talking to voters to ultimately get them to vote for them?
I think there's a lot of them. You look at the tax bill that was passed last year, and you look at all the now it's offset by some of the gas prices and costs there. But you look at the extra checks that most Americans are getting. You look at no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on tips, new revolutionary tax structures that are brand new. You look at the bipartisan housing bill that was passed. And I think district by district, Republicans are going to have the message that's going to say, hey, we're listening, we hear you, and we have the better platform.
Is the president doing enough? I think he held 2 tele-rallies yesterday. He was in Ohio today. What more can he do, knowing full well he's still obviously dealing with the war? Does he need to be out there a little bit more, or do you think he's doing enough right now?
I think the president still needs to do a better job of explaining why we're in Iran. It's clear to most that, it's about nuclear weapons and such, but I think a better explanation would be needed. And I think getting him out there and getting him on message like that, and that he is dealing with the inflation issue and making it better and making sure that he does relate and care about the American people, I think that would be helpful for sure over the closing months of the campaign.
And Jeff, really quick before I ask Jay one last question, what do you make of the South Carolina primary? Darlene Graham, Ralph Norman headed to a runoff to be the nominee to take the full term following the passing of Lindsey Graham. Do you like Darlene Graham's chances there?
Yes, I do. I mean, you look at Ralph Norman, and he took 5th in the governor's race just a month ago or so, and this is purely just about name ID. Russell Fry was probably the better candidate than he was, but just didn't have enough name ID, statewide name ID. So I expect Darlene Graham, especially with the president's endorsement, to carry it in a couple weeks. It's a short runoff there, and I expect Senator Graham to continue in the Senate.
Jay, what other races are you watching now? And as the calendar continues to tick toward November, are there any maybe not so highly reported races that are coming up that folks should be paying attention to, or maybe that you're paying attention to as a Democrat?
Sure. Yeah, well, look, one tonight, John Larson right now, the congressman from Connecticut, is a longtime congressman, 20, 30 plus years in the House, is currently losing pretty significantly from last check I had about 15 minutes ago. And I think that says something. That says something about generational change and age. And Democrats have ridden off of that message a lot this year. As far as future elections go, look, I think one that I'm paying attention to that has been a little bit under the radar as far as the popularity of other Senate races this year is next week in Florida with Vindman running. I mean, he's raised a significant amount of money. He has a significant backstory. Obviously, him and his brother both have become political stalwarts over the last several years. But I believe in a year like this, again, I mean, let's just be honest, Republicans continue to do a horrible on the economy. We have 30,000 job loss this month. Gas is getting ready to go up to $6 a gallon. There is no plan to stop the war in Iran. I mean, we're just continuing to see excuses here by the Trump administration, which I'm not shocked about. I think Jeff may be. And look, I think here at the end of the day, it's for Democrats we're going to pull this out, and it's going to be a big blue wave, no matter who's running on the ticket. And I think Republicans should take note of that, starting now.
All right,
and I'll just say I didn't hear anything. Sorry, I didn't hear anything about what the Democrats are going to do or what they stand for. I just heard anti-Trump stuff, and that's all they have on the campaign trail, and that's not a winning message.
There is the rub. All right, Jeff Burton,
Says
GOP
strategist, right?
Jay Satterfield, Democrat strategist. Guys, thank you so much. I'm sure we were gonna have you back in on another Tuesday, and of course, with November right around the corner, we'll be talking many more times. Thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We appreciate it. We're gonna take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be joined by the likes of Robby Soave. Gonna have a former congressman as well, just to continue to talk about the Democrats versus Republicans, Democrats versus Democrats. This is the Hill Decision Desk 26 Data Nerds. We are back in 2 minutes. All right, welcome back to the Hill Decision Desk 26 Data Nerds 9:02 on the East Coast. We are live in Washington, D.C. My name's Cory Smith. We appreciate you being by the channel tonight as we watch more polls close and more results start to come in. Wisconsin and Minnesota polls just closed a few minutes ago. So once we start to see some numbers roll in, we will bring those to you. Let's welcome in our next pair of guests, Robby Soave, who you know, who you love, co-host of Rising, and former Congressman Joe Cunningham, a Democrat from South Carolina, who I've had the pleasure of speaking to a few times since I've been with the Hill and NewsNation. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here tonight. Joe, I'll start with you. What races are you watching tonight? What candidates are you watching tonight? And if you can, spare a few words for your home state of South Carolina and the Republican primary going on right now.
Yeah, of course. I'll speak to what I know. Here in Charleston, South Carolina, I think we're just finishing watching this special election here in the Republican primary. It looks like Lindsey Graham's sister, Miss Darlene Graham, is going to advance along with Ralph Norman. I think it's just called for him as well. Mm-hmm. I think Graham has benefited tremendously from name ID. I think that she is probably in a much weaker position one-on-one as opposed to being in a crowded field. And I think the longer voters get to compare her candidacy and compare her directly to a more experienced alternative, I think the harder this race gets for her. That's the way I see it.
Robby, what races you watching tonight, my friend? Yep, you're muted. You're muted. Should have warned you.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you. Loud.
All right. I've been silenced yet again by my own technology. Well, I was just saying that, I feel like there's pressure every Tuesday to hype up the importance of these results. This one's a little less interesting than last week. Maybe I'm just saying that as a former Michigander. Francesca Hong is a fascinating individual, another very, very to the left progressive candidate for governor of Minnesota. But she's way ahead in the polling, so I fully expect her to win. It's been interesting to see that people like AOC and Bernie Sanders have not exactly been flocking to her candidacy. AOC giving that interview over the weekend where she's like, "Well, I haven't really checked it out yet." I think you know what's going on there. It was her comments about Thanksgiving that have them spooked, but she's likely to be the candidate. In South Carolina, it's interesting. Darlene Graham has appeared on the political scene very recently due to the unfortunate death of her brother, and Trump has handpicked her for that race, and that gives me an expectation that she will eventually win. And when it goes to a runoff, as it was widely expected to do. So no huge shocker there. There's that Connecticut House seat. The candidates John Larson and Luke Bronin is another one where there's a more moderate incumbent facing a very progressive challenge. We see the way every single one of these are going. The through line is the same. Democratic primary voters are very furious with their establishment. Palestine is a litmus test issue, and they're moving very much to the left, including by picking people I think might be too radical for general elections, but primary voters don't care about that. That is the major theme of the year.
Joe, we just spoke with Jay Satterfield, a dirt road Democrat, self-described from Georgia. You're there in South Carolina. What is the debate? How is it being digested by Democrats in the South who look at New York and Denver, but now also look at the Midwest and Michigan and perhaps in Wisconsin and see the rise of you can say progressive, democratic, socialist labels are difficult, but they agree on many things. How is that debate landing there in South Carolina?
I don't think it's landed here in South Carolina yet, to be honest. I don't think it's reached its way south of the Mason-Dixon line. But as I look across the horizon, and we all scratch our heads asking, like, what's led us to this point? I think it's a couple of things. Number one, I think over 90% of our congressional districts are decided in the primary. They're heavily gerrymandered. So when you have these dark blue districts, I think they're going to push further and further to the left. And I think that's what you're seeing, number one. Number two, you're seeing, as mentioned before, a huge dissatisfaction with, this Democratic establishment, the establishment that propped up Joe Biden and, refused to hold an open primary, who helped kick Dean Phillips off the ballot in several states. Like, there is a lot of disagreement and frustration with that. And so I think that's what we're seeing. And we're also not only just the frustration with what happened the last few years, but just the lack of new ideas. There needs to be a cohesive vision within the Democratic Party. And there's been this vacuum. And I think what the DSA, their popularity has been driven by them walking in and filling that vacuum. Now, I disagree with the ideas, but they're at least filling it with some ideas,
How then do Democrats approach messaging when candidates like a Francesca Hong or an Abdul El Sayed are sort of used by Republicans as sort of the boogeyman? This is what the Democratic Party is. Forget about the fact that these are two people from 2 states out of 50. But this is who you need to be afraid of. How do Democrats get through that and maybe try to bring some nuance to the conversation?
Yeah, the Thanksgiving comment was just bizarre. I don't know what you can't explain that one. I think everybody's got to run their own races, and I can tell you, being a Democrat that flipped a R+13 district, you just got to focus on your own race and your own district. And when you feel like you need to or want to break with the party, you do that. I can tell you in South Carolina, the biggest liability as a Democrat running here is having that D beside your name. And a lot of that's been driven by this national identity of the party. And in part, what you're seeing with the DSA and other parts, culturally speaking. So the people who want to win in red areas are people probably running on their own record and own ideas as opposed to what's known as the Democratic ones.
Robby, a week after El Sayed's win in Michigan and perhaps on the heels of Francesca Hong's win in Wisconsin, what have you made of the GOP messaging on some of these candidates and sort of painting a broad brush over the party, using them as sort of the example as this is the face of the Democratic Party? Has anything surprised you about some of the messaging that's been out there, or is it sort of par for the course?
Well, it's not surprising, but I think Mike Rogers, for instance, the Republican candidate in Michigan, is making a really smart pitch to moderate Democrats, saying there is a place for you in my campaign. If you just think that Abdul El Sayed is a bridge too far, Mike Rogers is a pretty normal, standard, even a little bit boring Republican that could have been right out of the 80s or 90s era Republicans, Bush Republican. And this is a state that Trump won twice. So we'll see. I think the problem is in the Democratic Party to try to sap the momentum of these leftist candidates is that there's just no argument that the establishment or the moderate or the centrists or the liberals have to make. It's for exactly the reasons Joe just said. They're associated with Biden. They're associated with losing with Kamala Harris just by getting destroyed. And so they don't have any wind in their sails right now. What they need to happen they need to believe in themselves again, the more moderate elements of the Democratic Party. That won't happen until one of these leftists costs them something important. If Abdul El Sayed loses the Michigan race, but like Tallarico wins in Texas or something like that, if that costs Democrats control of the Senate because they didn't have a slightly more normal candidate in a state that Trump won, you're going to see the establishment come roar. They're going to come at them with fire and blood. They're going to be ready to fight again. That's what it will take. But contrary-wise, if Democrats do just fine and take the Senate with and the House with leftist candidates everywhere, I think that's going to put pressure on the party to nominate someone much more to the left as a presidential candidate in 2028.
So, Joe, I guess if you're an establishment Democrat, then what do you say? I mean, if I'm an establishment Democrat and I ran in a primary, somebody had the chance to beat me in a race and they didn't. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm the candidate. I'm the person who has won this race. How does the establishment sort of pick itself back up and say, yes, I know we lost to Trump in 24, but there are still many more establishment moderate Democrats than there are far left DSA Democrats.
Yeah, no, look, I think Robby's assessment is spot on with how this plays out, and depending on how these different candidates fare come November. But I think the Democratic Party has to do two things. Number one, it has to acknowledge where it's gone wrong in the past and be honest with voters and have a little bit of humility. Secondly, there needs to be new ideas and new vision. And we have a lot of threats in this country, whether it be private equity owning 1 out of 4 homes, whether it be big pharma controlling the cost of prescription drugs, AI, suppressing wages and taking away jobs. These are social media and its impact on kids. I mean, we got some real challenges in this country. And despite what people say about Trump, he puts ideas out there, whether it be, the Trump account, whether it be the no taxes on tips. Like, despite what you may think about, there are ideas coming out of his mouth. And the Democratic Party needs to have some bold ideas that fix the problems of working class Americans and parents trying to raise families. I think if they can do that, look, the ground is fertile. I think with Trump's favorability ratings, the war in Iran, the economy, I mean, Democrats have never had a better opportunity than they do come this November and possibly 2028. And I just hope we don't squander it.
Robby, to that point on the war in Iran, this thing turned 6 months old on August 28th. Is there a sort of timeline where it may be too far gone for perhaps oil prices to come down and gas prices to come down? In other words, does the president need to get this thing sort of wrapped up with enough time to spare before the election, or can he survive with a, look, I know it's hard, but Iran can't have a nuclear weapon when we have got to make that happen?
Yeah, it's like that internet meme. Now was the best time to do it. 5 minutes from now is the second best time. They got to get it over with. You'd think the Republican Party would have learned by now that an unpopular war in the Middle East does not make for a winning political strategy. And this war is less popular than the last ones. So there's no way around it. It's sapping enthusiasm for the president's agenda, not because most Americans, I presume, think that the government of Iran is nefarious and that we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. But, it becomes, what are we willing to do to stop it? Are we willing to deal with a significant amount of economic pain, depletion of our missile supplies? Just to work out a deal with them that is basically identical to the deal we already had in place? I think a lot of Americans, even Republicans, frankly, are confused because this was never, brought to them and said, this is what we're doing and why. It was never voted on by Congress. I've been critical of that from the start. They just did it, and then they tried to explain why they were doing it. That doesn't even mean it's wrong to do it. But they went about justifying it, I think, in a foolish way, and that's what's hurt them. It's hurting them. It's obvious it's hurting them. People don't like economic pain. I don't know how many times the American people have to vote against suffering more in terms of pocketbook issues before someone takes that seriously. The good news for Trump and the administration is they could wrap it up tomorrow, and there would be maybe not a massive polling swing in their favor, but it would certainly be good for the midterm prospects, and a little bit better might be good enough to keep control of the Senate. We're looking at some close races in Michigan, Texas. I think Maine will be very, very close, even though the polls have Susan Collins down. She's dramatically overperformed them in the past. She's a beast. I think there are like 4 or 5 very, very close Senate races right now. So every little bit counts. So yes, the administration should bring this to a close and try to keep control of the Senate.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Robby, Joe, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it as always. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday night. We will see you both again very soon. All right, let's go back to Wisconsin. We have NewsNation correspondent Mills Hayes in Madison at Francesca Hong's watch party. Mills, polls closed about 15 minutes ago. What's the mood like now that you are inside?
Hi there, Cory. Well, the mood is pretty excited. There are more than 100 people that are out here at this election night watch party. They've got CNN on in the background, and there are lots of people with signs. Everyone is looking forward to hopefully a victory tonight, at least for them. They would like to see Francesca Hong win the nomination for the Democratic side for the governor's race here in Wisconsin. And this really is kind of seen as another test of the future of the Democratic Party, because we do have another matchup between someone who's on the progressive left side of the party versus someone who is on the more moderate side of the party. Francesca Hong, she is a self-described Democratic socialist as well, and if she is elected come November, she would be America's first ever Democratic socialist governor, and we see her running against the moderate candidate in this race, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, who has been endorsed by the current Democratic governor, Tony Evers. And that was something that spurred a lot of frustration for Hong supporters, because a lot of her supporters also voted for Governor Evers. Now, he even has said that he doesn't think that Hong could win in the general election, but that's something that her supporters dismiss as really nonsense, Cory.
So to that point, do her voters sort of feel how Michigan voters felt when folks were questioning whether Abdul El Sayed could win a primary, not even speaking of the general election that he is now slated to participate in? Do they believe that the label and the muck that Republicans have been throwing at Francesca Hong, maybe even some Democrats have been throwing at her, will stick, or do they feel pretty good about her chances given the environment we're in where there is, some anger on the Democratic side at Democratic incumbents and also Republicans being in power.
Right, Cory. I mean, they feel strong. It is very similar to the Michigan Senate race, which was a race that I covered as well. I spoke with a lot of voters there, a lot of supporters that felt very similar. They feel like someone like Francesca Hong really stands out against the normal politician that they see. And so they like someone who has a working class background. She was a chef previously. They see her as someone who can come in and kind of shake things up, and they dismiss those concerns. But I did speak with a couple of voters today when I was outside a polling location that told me they did have a hard time deciding between David Crowley and Francesca Hong. I even spoke with people who voted for Hong who say that they feel like David Crowley is still a good candidate. If he wins, they are really more so concerned about beating the Republican come the general election. And we actually just got news from Decision Desk HQ that they are projecting that Congressman Tom Tiffany is winning the Republican nomination. He, of course, was endorsed by President Trump. And so I do see from and hear from people on the ground that they just want someone who can beat Tom Tiffany. But all of the Democratic voters that I've been speaking with here in Madison feel like that's something that a lot of the candidates on the Democratic side could do. But remember, we are in Madison, right? Madison is very blue. It has been for a very long time. And so people here, they are very frustrated with the Trump administration. They want to see someone who can stand up against the Trump administration be in the governor's office, Cory.
All right, Mills Hayes live in Madison. Mills, I mentioned pizza earlier, but you're in Wisconsin, so hopefully there are lots of cheese curds there for you to enjoy on this Tuesday night. We appreciate your time, my friend.
I would kill for some cheese curds. Thank you.
Wouldn't we all? Mills Hayes live in Madison. Mills, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and bring in Sadiq Shakochi, congressional reporter for The Hill, and Nicholas Anastasio, Senate campaign correspondent for National Journal. Good evening to you both. Sadiq, I want to start with you. Like Abdul El Sayed, like some of the candidates up in New York City, Francesca Hong has risen to prominence quickly in the American political consciousness. What do folks on the Hill make of her rise and make of candidates like her who aren't necessarily household names, which can be a benefit, but also maybe not as battle-tested and vetted and could have some, we'll just say, interesting comments in their past that have come back to the surface?
Yeah, I spoke to a bunch of Democratic lawmakers this week who all told me that, the rise of Francesca Hong, as well as what we saw last week in the Michigan Senate race, all kind of indicate, that voters want change in the Democratic Party. And so I was talking to a Democratic strategist who put it this way: it's the Democratic Party needs altering, not to throw out the full closet of the Democratic Party, but that there does need to be some alterations made within the party. And that's what we're seeing right now as voters clamor for progressive change. They want fresh new blood. They want a fresh new vision in the party. And that's exactly what someone like Francesca Hong brings to the table. She's a progressive candidate. She's not backed by the establishment. She's not a traditional candidate. And that's exactly what they're looking for. That's what they're asking for. And basically what we saw last week, with this moderate versus progressive Democratic faction battle playing out is exactly what we're seeing this week with the race between Francesca Hong and David Crowley, who is an establishment favorite, who has been endorsed by Governor Tony Evers in the race. And so this is going to be very interesting to see, who ends up advancing. And not just in Wisconsin. I do want to also point out that in Minnesota, we're seeing a similar battle play out where you have moderate Angie Craig, who is a representative, battle-tested moderate, versus Penny Flanagan, who's a progressive. And so we're kind of seeing those two factions play out in Minnesota as well. And so it is going to be a very interesting race, but a lot of Democratic lawmakers and a lot of Democratic strategists I spoke to, just recently told me that, this is what they have been expecting. This is the change that voters are asking for. And that, this is a similar movement to what they saw with the Republican Party when MAGA came in, when President Trump came in and, that kind of took over the movement of the Republican Party. We're kind of seeing a similar movement play out. Now, I did Democratic lawmakers did tell me that they don't expect the progressive movement to completely overtake the Democratic Party. Obviously, the Democratic Party, as they put it, is a big tent that includes moderates, that includes progressive, that includes a wide variety of people with different ideological perspectives on things. But I think what they mentioned is that voters are looking for change, and this is the change that we're seeing.
Nicholas, Sadiqa mentioned that Senate primary in Minnesota where you got Angie Craig and Peggy Flanagan fighting it out for the Democratic nominee there. And then you've also got the news out of South Carolina, Ralph Norman, Darlene Graham, the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, going to be headed to a runoff. What are you looking at tonight? Do any of these Senate primaries excite you a little bit more than the other? Nope, you're muted. You're muted. Let's unmute. It happens.
Apologies.
There we go.
I think the South Carolina one, it was definitely very interesting. I think ultimately Senator Graham, she has that well-known last name in South Carolina politics, but it was very apparent that she was going up against pretty major opponents, and it's going to really come down to how Congressman Norman's going to be able to consolidate that type of coalition. But I think the big story, and it's what I'm paying attention to in the Minnesota Senate primary, is how much can ads really make a difference. In the Minnesota primary, Angie Craig, it seems like she's outspending Flanagan in terms of her campaign money combined with outside spending money nearly 2 to 3 to 1. Ultimately, that is a race where Flanagan has benefited from a lot of the grassroots momentum. She has the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party's endorsement. She has a lot of support, including from retiring Senator Tina Smith, as well as progressives across the country like Senator Bernie Sanders. Ultimately, in a Democratic electorate, given that Flanagan is already the lieutenant governor, she has an established presence within Minnesota politics. This should be a race that's a bit easier for her, especially against a moderate like Angie Craig. Ultimately, the Congresswoman has really kind of taken this race into a new direction since former NFL sportscaster Michelle Tafoya got in and tried to really sell the electability argument, especially following the state social services fraud scandal we were seeing brewing last year. Ultimately, a lot's gone on in Minnesota politics. There was the assassinations last year. There was the state social services fraud conversation, and there was Operation MetroSurge earlier this year. So there's a lot for Democrats to pay attention to and to think about when they nominate their candidate. But ultimately, as we saw in the South Carolina race, where Norman, he spent and self-funded a lot when it came to the gubernatorial primary earlier this year. But there wasn't as much money seen ahead of this primary. In many ways, he relied on his name ID and relied on selling himself to voters directly, and ultimately benefited in the areas that he's already strong in, like Greenville County, like Spartanburg County. So ultimately, the big question is whether money and establishment endorsements really make a difference. And in a place like Minnesota, if Craig's winning, it's because she was able to outpace Flanagan and just getting her message out there.
So as we've been talking tonight, we did get some more projections. As Mills mentioned, there in Madison, Wisconsin, Tom Tiffany has won the Republican primary for governor. Luke Bronin has won the Democratic primary for Connecticut's first House district. And Senator Amy Klobuchar has won the Minnesota governor Democratic primary there. So we're waiting for more results to come in. Jeff, who's running the board, go ahead and pull up that Wisconsin gubernatorial race, because we did see some numbers start to come in for that Democratic primary, and especially in some big places like Waukesha County, where right now David Crowley's leading Francesca Hong by about 16 or so points. Sadiqa, I've mentioned this a few times. When you talk about the Democratic Party being the sort of big tent, you're starting to see establishment Democrats, moderate Democrats come out there and sort of welcome the far left wing of the party closer, but also maybe distancing themselves a little bit. Jamie Raskin made the comment that, hey, when people say socialism, they're not necessarily talking about Venezuela or Cuba. They're talking about maybe European democratic socialism. What is the electability argument coming from Democrats who you were talking to on the Hill?
Yeah, so I think the electability argument that people are talking about is, at least from what I've been hearing from moderate Democrats and progressive Democrats, seems like the main theme that I'm hearing is affordability and cost of living. That's kind of the main thing that Democrats, are united on or campaigning on. That's kind of the big thing that they're talking about. Now, there obviously are some other issues as well that have really rifted or driven apart, these two factions of the party. One of the big things that we've been looking at is Israel and Palestine. I think that's such a big issue, and that's something that has really divided the party, and that's really what we're seeing playing out in some of these elections and some of these races where you have a progressive candidate who's very pro-Palestine, who has very specific issues, who has advocated for let's block U.S. military aid to Israel, and then you have the moderate Democrats who are more pro-Israel saying let's not do that, let's continue U.S. military aid to Israel, and so you have two sides of the party kind of fighting it out in two different ways on this issue. And so I do think that foreign policy is a big issue, especially in the 2026 midterms, and especially with the unhappiness that Democrats have had with, how President Trump and the White House has handled foreign policy. And so that is kind of a big talking point. But I do agree. I think the electability argument here is that, they want more progressive candidates. They want change in the party, and they want to see more aggression towards Republicans. I think that was also part of the argument, is that a lot of progressive Democrats I spoke to on the Hill have said that they want more, they want Congress to do more to stand up to President Trump. And right now they're not happy with, how they've been doing that and how they've been going about that, especially with the war powers resolutions. Those have passed, but they, haven't landed on President Trump's desk. And so there's so many different actions that Democrats are eyeing to take if they do win back the House. And so one of the biggest electability arguments I would say is, how can we stand up to Donald Trump? And that's something that Democrats have been talking about. A lot of progressive Democrats have been talking about. And I think moderate Democrats have a different view on that because, again, they're running in very tight competitive races. And so for them, it's not about the aggression. For them, it's about how do I make sure that swing voters would still support me in 2028 and not drive them away, and then also make sure at the same time that I am supporting my party's values. And so it seems to, two different sides of the coin here.
All right, Sadiq Sakochi, congressional reporter for The Hill. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Nicholas, I know you're going to stick around. We're going to head to break. We'll be back with more coverage of Tuesday night's primaries across the country. You're watching The Hill, Decision Desk 26. We're back. All right, welcome back to The Hill Decision Desk 26 Data Nerds. About a half hour left in our coverage of multiple primaries tonight. Want to go ahead and welcome back Jeffrey Skelly, a chief elections analyst from DDHQ and Nicholas Anastasio, Senate campaign correspondent for the National Journal. Jeff, I'll go ahead and let you run the show for a little bit. As we were just talking last segment, I know we got some results from Milwaukee, Dane, and Waukesha, the big counties there in Wisconsin. What are you seeing right now?
Yeah, well, we did just get a chunk of votes in from Milwaukee that actually weren't as good for David Crawley as I think he would have hoped. That he is the county executive. Now, maybe they're from the city of Milwaukee, but nonetheless, there's a long way to go in this race. But right now, David Crawley is in the lead, and essentially, coming into this, Francesca Hong, obviously, she's gotten a ton of attention as the Democratic Socialist, but she was leading in the polls. Primary polls are fluid, though, and it is worth noting that there were a lot of people who dropped out of that race, and that voters were looking around and figuring out who they were going to vote for. So the fact that Crawley is in this is not maybe a shocker, but I would say that at the end of the day, I would almost be. I don't know if I'd be more surprised if Crawley actually won this versus Stevens nearly winning in Michigan. But nonetheless, this is a very close contest. And like right now, the boiler room, the projection team at Decision Desk HQ is viewing Wisconsin governor as essentially a toss-up right now.
Wow. Nicholas, is that something that you were expecting coming into tonight, given all the media attention around Francesca Hong?
I think there was a lot of conversation after the Michigan Senate primary of how to approach this race. I mean, I give any credit to any pollster that's trying to pull this race, because you have to take into consideration that people have been voting since July, and that a lot of those votes have already been baked in. And at least with Wisconsin versus Michigan, you're not able to just spoil your ballot. How you vote is how you voted for the most part. So, it was always going to be very interesting. Also, I think what was very apparent is that Hong wasn't as focused when it came to putting up ad spends, and Crowley and his folks definitely paid attention to that. That's important, especially in some rural areas where it's very hard to get grassroots door knocking out. As we saw in Michigan, you can't take advantage of what gets to rural voters a lot. So we'll definitely see as more rural counties come in. But, I would say the Michigan Senate primary wasn't as confusing for me, just because I really just doubted when it came to just an enormous amount of spending we were seeing come Stevens' way. But, it's a sign that candidates cannot get too comfortable. And I think for Hong, she's gone through this race where the biggest controversy she's gotten recently has mostly just been those social media comments, as well as a lot of the scrutiny over her labeling herself as a Democratic Socialist. Meanwhile, a lot of her candidates have had to go through a ton of other scrutiny, some just having to drop out entirely because of their scandals. So, ultimately Hong's campaign was just relying on what the infrastructure was there. And, I think if Crowley comes ahead out of this, which obviously, I'm going to trust Skelly on this. It seems like a toss-up when it comes to this primary. I think it'll be a testament to a lot of the late-stage support, and that he was potentially maybe doing everything right in those last final weeks of this very unprecedented primary.
Jeffrey, I was going to ask you to walk me through some Minnesota races, and perfect timing because we just got a projection there.
Yes, I was just going there. Yes. So, there's been a lot of talk about the Democratic primary for Senate in Minnesota between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig. But on the Republican side, Michelle Tafoya, we are projecting, has won the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate. Former sports broadcaster, running, trying basically to give the GOP a shot in Minnesota. It's worth noting, Minnesota, I think it has an obvious reputation as a blue state, because it almost always votes Democratic for president, but it usually isn't by a lot. And there's definitely a big gap between the Minneapolis, St. Paul and suburbs part of the state and the rest of the state. And so in that sense, there is certainly for instance, if Kamala Harris were president right now, I think this Senate race would be potentially very interesting. But at the moment, the outlook for Decision Desk HQ has been, in our forecast, is that basically Democrats have about a 9 in 10 shot of holding onto the seat. Tina Smith, the incumbent, is retiring. She endorsed Flanagan. We'll see how things play out. On that side, we are a long way from knowing the outcome on the Democratic side. But Michelle Tafoya will be the Republican nominee in that race.
Can you show us where things do stand in that Angie Craig race with Peggy Flanagan as of right now?
Yes. One of my tabs somewhere, one of these tabs on my computer.
Among the myriad that are open, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, it's ever increasing. Okay. Should be coming up here. Yes.
Yeah,
so Flanagan's to an early lead, but the big thing is like, look, we have the Anoka, which is a kind of suburban, exurban county outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. St. Paul's right here, Minneapolis right here. But we don't have any vote in from the two. These are the two biggest. Hennepin's the biggest, where Minneapolis is, but then Ramsey, where St. Paul is. There'll be a lot there. So we're a long way from knowing how this is going to pan out. And it's worth noting that Angie Craig's district is basically this part. And hey, we just got some vote in actually from that part. Well, not a lot. No, it was a fair bit. Dakota, actually, the fact that Flanagan's running about even there is maybe a good sign for her, because this is more Craig's neck of the woods, the southern suburbs and exurbs of Minneapolis. So that might be a good tea leaf for Flanagan's chances, but still a while to go. So we're definitely not making a projection.
And real quick, the Republican governor primary, which may be the test of all tests for a Trump endorsement, if Mike Lindell can somehow pull this race out, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, so Lindell currently trailing Lisa Demuth, who's actually the Speaker of the House. It's a tied House power sharing arrangement. She's or maybe they have a one seat. She is the Speaker in an extremely narrowly divided state House, Republican. So they have divided government in Minnesota right now with the Democrat governor and a very narrowly Democratic controlled state Senate. But she's running for governor here. I think it would not be surprising if she would be maybe their best candidate statewide. Kendall Qualls, more conservative, but did have the endorsement of the state party convention. And then Mike Lindell, who is obviously Trump's choice in this and has been a big backer of conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. And did lead in some polling in the lead up to this, but not by a lot, with a lot of undecided. So, it wouldn't really shock me if Demuth or Lindell won. So, we'll see. I suspect, early on here, we got some votes in from some of these suburban counties around Minneapolis, St. Paul that are better for Demuth. Demuth. Sorry, I keep mispronouncing it. It's pronounced Demuth. Anyway, we'll see. Lindell might do better on the periphery and in the exurbs, and there are a lot more Republican votes sort of out in the exurbs and rural areas of the state. So we're also a long way from knowing, I think, here too.
Nicholas, what are you hearing out there when you're talking to strategists, when you're talking to voters, when it comes to where things stand in the Senate right now? Do you get a sense, Democrats may be feeling a little bit better about their chances, given the kumbaya we've seen in Michigan, the fact that they've moved on from the Graham Plattner situation? How are they feeling about their prospects of flipping that chamber?
If you were to ask me last year, I think Democrats were still talking about the 2-cycle process, even before, right before Graham Plattner had ended up withdrawing, and after we had heard the sexual assault allegations against him come up. That was even at that point, there were Democrats leading into there, as we had heard about the text messages, as we had seen the New York Times story relating to his treatment of his ex-girlfriends. There was still discussion of this might take 2 cycles for Democrats, but overall, I think Democrats feel that they have a shot. And, I look at 2006, when that was a pretty bad midterms for a Republican president, particularly in a second term for President George Bush. Ultimately, that was a type of Senate. That was a Senate cycle that got very, very tight to the end. But leading into it, there was still a lot of difficulty in finding those signs. A race like Virginia only really came online in August of that year. And so Democrats coming in, they have multiple opportunities at their disposal. It's just whether they all sort of fall in line, or like a 2020 where, they don't all just go to Democrats. It kind of is a split between Republicans and Democrats. North Carolina is still Democrats' best potential pickup opportunity. There's still a lot of targeting when it comes to Ohio and Alaska. Those races have really been neck and neck throughout the entirety of this year. And in Maine, Democrats are still keeping hope alive with their new candidate, Troy Jackson. Ultimately, the hope is that the environment is Democratic enough that it pushes Jackson over the line over Senator Susan Collins there. You have other opportunities like Iowa with State Representative Josh Turek, hoping that he can kind of catch up to Rob Sand in that governor's race and get enough of his voters that if Sand wins the governor's race, Turek can also cross that line. And there's still a lot of attention to Texas, where it's still yet to be seen where Paxton's really going to get a lot of outside money coming in to pair him up with Tallarico and to counter his message. So, ultimately, Democrats, I think, feel confident that they can get over that hump, but it's not a for sure thing.
All right. We are going to dip in shortly here to Darlene Graham's election night speech. I guess you can call it a victory speech. She is going to make the runoff. So she's won the semifinal, I guess, if you will. Let's go ahead and dip into that right now if we can.
Listening to your concerns and telling you more about me and my conservative values. I decided to answer the call to serve because South Carolina and President Trump need a leader who's tough, principled, and will fight to advance our conservative values in Washington. Lindsey and I grew up in one room in the back of a bar and liquor store where our parents worked long, hard hours to earn a living. That's where we learned a strong work ethic and the value of a dollar. From a young age, our parents taught us that you're not given anything in life, and no one owes you anything. If you want something, you work for it. That's how I've tried to live my life. I've spent my career serving the people of South Carolina. For the past 7 years, I led an agency dedicated to helping South Carolinians who are blind or visually impaired find employment, become more independent, and have the opportunity to provide for themselves and their families. I took a struggling agency and turned it into a national model. I never expected that career of service would lead me to the United States Senate. I certainly never expected it would happen under these circumstances. I've only been on the job in Washington for 3 weeks, and I've already passed a major piece of bipartisan legislation through the Senate that meant so much to Lindsey, the Russia sanctions bill, which I believe will end the bloodshed in Ukraine and keep Americans safer. I was also the deciding vote to confirm President Trump's Attorney General nominee, Todd Blanche. Some politicians get a major piece of their legislation passed, so I've already accomplished more in a few weeks than many do in decades. So I'm very proud of that. So when President Trump and others asked me to run for a full term in the Senate,
give her election night victory speech there in South Carolina, giving us a bit of her resume because she still is somewhat of an unknown. Jeffrey, Nicholas, guys, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. As always, we will see you the next primary night, but thank you so much. Want to bring back in Caroline Vakil. She is joining me right now here in studio. Caroline, we just heard Darlene Graham there. Grace Panetta also joining me. I thought it was interesting that in an election night victory speech as she heads into the runoff, she's giving her resume, letting people know who she is and that she is more than just Lindsey Graham's sister.
Yeah, I mean, I do definitely think that it's, she's trying to make that compelling case to, voters who haven't known her for more than, essentially a month since her brother died. And so I think that she is trying to, show, lean in and offer her biography a little bit, sort of make the case, not just that, she's Trump's endorsed candidate, but sort of leaning a bit on her brother's legacy, her own background, working in a state agency and, trying to make that case.
Grace, so she's headed to this runoff with Ralph Norman, which I think a lot of people did expect to happen. We were talking to Mick Mulvaney last week. He said this was not some unforeseen conclusion that she was just going to win the race outright. Do you anticipate this race being close because Ralph Norman can speak to his experience in Congress? As you just heard Darlene Graham say, she's already passed bills and she's already been the deciding vote for Donald Trump's attorney general pick. Who do you think has more work to do in order to convince voters in South Carolina that they should be the one to win the Senate seat?
Yeah, I think both of them clearly, by the fact that they're going into a runoff, have a lot of work to do going into it. It's wild. Lindsey Graham passed away only a month ago. It's been just a month of this. It's not really like we have a lot of polling to go off of. Darlene Graham is not a name I don't think many of us knew 5-6 weeks ago. So, she definitely does have a lot of work to do to introduce herself to the voters. Ralph Norman obviously just ran for governor. He's a little bit more known statewide, but also it's so hard to say because this is such a wonky, special election in the summer of of a midterm year. I would say Darlene Graham's probably favored because of her, small incumbency benefit, but it's definitely, going to be interesting.
Grace, we'll stick with you. You've been watching the results come in. Has anything stood out to you thus far? Any race you're sort of waiting with bated breath to get more results from?
Yeah, obviously this Wisconsin governor's race is looking pretty close. I think closer than probably some suspected, with a little under half of the vote in. That's just, goes to show it's been such a all over the place primary with people dropping out and getting back in. It's very hard to poll. But yeah, certainly, seeing a lot of looking a lot closer than I think a lot of people expected. And then obviously in Minnesota as well, still waiting on the results. I know y'all were just talking about the Senate primary. I'm also very interested in the House race in the 2nd congressional district too, that DDHQ has projected for Matt Little, the progressive, another big win for progressives.
What stood out to you about that race, Grace? What were you looking for there?
Yeah, so kind of like the Michigan 7 primary in Lansing last week. It was, kind of a three-way sort of contest between, Matt Little, the progressive, Matt Klein, who was a little bit more moderate, and then Kayla Berg, who had the backing of a lot of labor groups, and also Emily's List. And it's just another interesting sort of case of where the electorate is right now, and especially given that this is the congressional district that belonged to Angie Craig, who's now running for Senate. It was a battleground seat when she won it in 2018. It's gotten a little bit safer now, but another definitely significant pickup for progressives.
Jeffrey, if we can pull up that Minnesota Democratic primary for the Senate there, Angie Craig versus Peggy Flanagan. This has been a really interesting race to watch, Caroline, because again, it's pitting that moderate versus progressive, but these aren't too necessarily household names to folks who maybe don't pay attention to politics as much as we do.
Sure. I mean, I think Flanagan does have the benefit that she has run statewide with Tim Walz on a ticket. But certainly, I mean, you're looking at, two women who have had to, raise their profiles very quickly. And it's, as with a lot of races, it's kind of the race to who can define the other first the quickest, especially in advertising. That's kind of the name of the game here. And so we saw a lot of issues around immigration, particularly. And, Angie Craig's support for the Lake and Riley Act, these ICE-involved shootings that took place in Minnesota that really roiled things. Also the statewide, massive fraud scandal, I should say, where Peggy Flanagan has received some attacks from Craig on that and being liable to Republican attacks. And so I think those have been some of the issues that have sort of dominated the race in the quote-unquote race to define each other.
We've got about 8 or so minutes left. I want to go ahead and look ahead. If Francesca Hong pulls this thing out, does she get the Abdul Sayed treatment where immediately the attack ads start coming? You start hearing her name mentioned along with Abdul Sayed and the rest of Democrats as this is the face of the new Democratic Party.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think it's already starting. Tom Tiffany, the Republican nominee, has gone as far as to say that her candidacy represents a Democratic capitulation to socialism. I absolutely do think it'll be, a major attack line and one that she and a lot of other Democrats will have to contend with. A lot can change, tonight and going forward. But yeah, I think that is, and a state as closely divided as Wisconsin, definitely sort of a major factor and potential vulnerability for her.
Caroline, the Republicans who you speak to, the strategists, the voters, are they itching for a fight with a far left candidate, despite whatever momentum there may be behind their candidacy? Or are they ultimately the ones they want to see in a general election?
I think any progressive or, Democratic Socialist candidate that wins a primary, Republicans see that as a gift. They want to create a very stark contrast. They know the midterms are going to be a referendum, but they're going to be creating the sense that you're running for normalcy and maybe pragmatism versus the craziness of progressives and Democratic Socialists here. But of course, midterms are also a referendum on the party in power, so it's a double-edged sword here. And I'll also note that their progressives and DSA members also have a populist economic message, which is something that I think helped Trump and several of his own campaigns. And so I think Republicans know that it's a gift, but they also know not to take that gift for granted.
And Grace, for the Republicans out there, what are you running on? I mean, one big beautiful bill, which passed, but it seems like it was eons ago. You've got the bipartisan housing bill, the Russia sanctions bill, but the war in Iran looms large. Gas prices, food prices, utility prices loom large for the Republican Party, which is in power.
Yeah, well, what's really been interesting in the Republican governor's race is how much Tom Tiffany has kind of been tacking to the center. This is someone with a very conservative voting record in Congress, was notably supportive of President Trump's attempts to overturn his election loss in the state. But he's, really pivoting to a lot of, economic issues, ending property tax hikes, housing, taxes, all of these things that, are kind of speaking more to voters' desire to address affordability than some of these other issues. But certainly, with the war in Iran continuing, it's going to be a major Democratic message. And I think, Republicans would, like to make the race a referendum about anything other than the Trump presidency and what's happened in it. But, I do think that's going to be the central through line and theme of this year.
Caroline, do you get a sense of which party feels a little bit better here on, August 11th as we barrel toward November?
I think Democrats feel bullish about the House. They feel like the midterm environment is good, and they're even trying to now sort of say that even with these progressive wins, that this is still a good environment for Democrats. Good enough for a more progressive candidate to win. The question really remains with some of these Senate races: is it going to be enough for Democrats to actually be able to flip the upper chamber? That wasn't really a part of our discussion, at the start of 2025, and now some Democrats have tried to make that a focal point as well. That's kind of the big question. It seems more likely that Republicans will keep it, or it'll be tied, but still Vance with the tie-breaking vote there. So I think Democrats do feel good, but I think both sides, again, realize they can't really take anything for granted, with this political environment right now.
Grace, same question. Do you get a sense of which party feels best? And what are those undecided voters out there telling you about what it'll take to ultimately get their vote?
Yeah, I think this is going to be, an election really about the Trump presidency and costs, affordability. It's the issue that Republicans rode to a victory back in 2024, and it's still really on voters' minds. I also think that this is a moment of such fluidity and so many shakeups we've seen within the Democratic Party base. And I also think that, these midterms are a little bit of kind of the preview or transitioning into the wide open 2028 race, which is really going to be, wide open, a real sort of test case for where the American voters are. And I do think that these primaries are really going to set the agenda for that in a lot of ways. But in terms of the issues, I think economy, prices, and the impact of Trump 2.0.
Don't want to talk too much about 2028, Caroline, but I'll ask you just about more in the short-term future. What other races out there that are still coming up? I'm pulling up my handy-dandy email in terms of other primary nights. You've got August 18th, you've got Alaska, Florida, Wyoming. Florida's going to be juicy because there are a bunch of interesting races there. What's on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think Florida, the congressional map being redrawn is going to be certainly very interesting. And so I am very curious to see how some of those House primaries play out, some of the open seats. But then you've also, I mean, we could talk about Byron Donald's seat, where it has a whole cast of characters, including, 2 former congressmen running for that seat, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and whether or not, voters there decide that they want to vote for her or Black Democrat to represent that district. I think they're going to be interesting. And both in Florida and New Hampshire, I would say there's going to be some really interesting questions to watch for around AIPAC, which are roiling the races.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there for another Primary Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining us as we hang out with our friends and look at all these interesting races. Still so much more coverage to come at thehill.com. Of course, NewsNation has you covered for the rest of the night. But for everyone who has joined us, I'm Cory Smith. We will see you next Tuesday.